last time you were. Good evening, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and I'm pleased you could join us this evening for tonight's program, whether you're here in the theater or joining us on YouTube or Facebook. Before we hear from Evan Thomas about his new book, First, Sandra Day O'Connor, An American Life, I'd like to let you know about two other programs coming up next week. On Monday, April 29th at noon, historian Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers will tell us about her new book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. While bridging women's history, the history of the South, and African American history, Jones-Rogers' book prompts a rethinking of women's history and the history of slavery. And on Tuesday, April 30th at noon, Margaret Sarder and Alex Harris will introduce us to Hugh Mangum, an itinerant photographer who traveled through North Carolina and Virginia in the early 19th century. Their book, Where We Find Ourselves, the photographs of Hugh Mangum, 1897 to 1922, reveals an unparalleled view of life in the American South during a turbulent time of history. Check our website, archives.gov, or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates. You'll also find information about other National Archives programs and activities. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities. Visit its website, archivesfoundation.org, to learn more about the foundation and join online. And a little known secret that I keep telling anyone who listens, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the National Archives Foundation. Tonight's discussion is part of a series of programs related to our new exhibit opening May 10th, Rightfully Hers, American Women and the Vote. Rightfully Hers commemorates the centennial of the 19th Amendment and tells the story of women's struggle for voting rights as a critical step towards equal citizenship. In the exhibit, a series of spotlights will relate the stories of groundbreaking women who played critical roles in the fight for equality, not just the vote, but in opportunities and fair treatment. In the second half of the 20th century, Sandra Day O'Connor broke through barriers throughout her career in the law and famously became the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States. In a review for NPR, Nina Totenberg declares that author Evan Thomas breaks new ground with First. It is an unvarnished and psychologically intuitive look at the nation's first female Supreme Court justice and some of her contradictory characteristics. And Jeffrey Toobin, writing in the New York Times, calls First a richly detailed picture of her personal and professional life and a fascinating and revelatory biography. Evan Thomas is one of the most respected historians and journalists writing today. He's the best-selling author of 10 works of fiction, including works on John Paul Jones, Dwight Eisenhower, Robert Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and Barack Obama. In his 24 years as an editor and writer at Newsweek, he wrote more than 100 cover stories. Thomas has won numerous journalism awards, including the National Magazine Award. Evan Thomas is a fellow of the Society of American Historians and has taught writing at both Princeton and Harvard. Michael Beschloss has long been a great friend of the National Archives and serves as a vice president of the board of directors of the National Archives Foundation. He's an award-winning historian, best-selling author, and Emmy winner. He's the NBC News presidential historian and a contributor to PBS NewsHour. In addition to his work with the National Archives Foundation, he's a trustee of the White House Historical Association and former trustee of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Evan Thomas and Michael Beschloss.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much, David. We're delighted that you're here, and you started this evening off, as always, so nicely. I think maybe the best place to start, I called Evan before. We've been close friends for 30 years. I said, should we pretend that we don't know each other, and I'll give you this scorching interrogation? He said, do whatever you feel like. So there are a couple of things. I haven't asked him the last couple of months because I knew I would be doing this, and I actually wanted to wait until now so that this would have the added advantage of being a genuinely spontaneous conversation. So to begin with, Evan, where did the idea for the book start?
Justice O'Connor wrote a book called The Lazy Bee about growing up on this cattle ranch in Arizona. Amazing story. And it did pretty well. It was about 20 years ago. And of course, Random House was eager for her to write her memoirs.
Right.
So they badgered her for a couple of decades.
Meaning a whole book, whole
Meaning
life.
a whole book, whole life, the full deal.
Right.
And she was interested enough to entertain it. I was brought in as a possible ghostwriter for that. But I could tell in the day I spent with her that she didn't really want to do it.
Was that you, or was there something else?
I wondered.
What did you say?
Well, this is actually, it's a relevant question because she can be a little frosty and standoffish. She's almost a professional politician, so she knows how to work a crowd. She knows how to be friendly when she wants to be, but she also knows how to be a little chilly. Mm-hmm. And there is a part of her that is deeply private. And I sensed when I was hanging around with her for this one day that was not a part of her that she was going to reveal in any memoir, or maybe a whole lot else. Mm-hmm. Now,
did you find the lazy bee? Did you feel once you went and researched the same period yourself that she had withheld things to a great degree?
Yeah, she revealed everything in it except really about herself. Mm-hmm. It was a very
slight problem with the memoir.
It's a vivid. Well, actually, Linda Greenhouse, who's the great New York Times correspondent about the Supreme Court, and when she reviewed The Lazy Bee in the New York Times, called it a palimpsest, meaning that you can see this. It's like there's this layer of writing, but then there's another layer of writing over it. And you have to kind of look through the first layer to get to the second layer. Mm-hmm. And what she meant was it's a vivid account of life on the ranch. And underneath it, you can sort of divine Sandra Day, was her right. maiden name. But you don't really see it. And this, I learned, was intentional. When she wrote The Lazy Bee, she did it with her brother, Alan. Alan's a full-bred cowboy. I mean, the real deal. And he'd run the ranch for the whole time. And a funny, very smart, vivid guy. And he wrote the first draft, and he was too honest about their mother and father. Because their father, although he was a magnificent guy, was a bit of a bully and somewhat of a difficult guy. He was not the kind of strong and silent type. He could complain, and he could be a little rough on the people around him. And she took all that out. And also modulated somewhat.
Did she take it out because she thought it was unseemly, or because she didn't remember him that way, or?
Both. Uh-huh. Both. One of the letters that comes to my mind is he writes her, she's in Germany, 1950s, and she writes, "I am surrounded by women," meaning his wife and his other daughter, who I'm paraphrasing here, net minuses. Who take out more than they put back. You are the sole exception. Mm-hmm. So he doted on her. Mm-hmm. He was devoted to her. She knew what a difficult guy he was, but he adored her, and she drew great confidence from that. It was not easy being, even as the adored child. It wasn't easy. I'm going to tell you her favorite story that will give you a feel for life on the ranch. When she was 15, he taught her how to fire a rifle when she was 10 and drive a truck and all that. When she was 15, her job was to take lunch out to the roundup, miles across the prairie. And she gets up at 5 a.m., she cooks the roast, she cooks the cake. She has a flat tire on the way out. So it takes her an hour to change the tire. She's a slender gal and has to jump on the jack. And she gets there and her father looks at her and says, "You're late." And she said, "Well, Dad, I had a flat tire." He said, "Next time, leave earlier." That's life on the ranch, no excuses. Mm-hmm. She always told the story to her law clerks. The message was very clear to them, no excuses. And that's the way Dad was, but he did adore her. Mm-hmm. The mom is, in some ways, a more interesting character, a more subtle character, because because Mr. Day could be a little abusive to her at night when he'd had a drink or two. And she took it in an interesting way. She wasn't passive. She knew when to stand up to him, but she didn't get into stupid fights with him. She didn't get into kind of ego fights with him. And Sandra watched that. That was the most important lesson she took from that ranch, was don't get into don't take the bait. Don't allow yourself to be provoked by some overbearing male. As it happened, Sandra O'Connor spent the rest of her life dealing with overbearing males. And this was very useful training.
Yeah, very, very much so. So before we get on to how you made the deal and decided to write the book, If she was so private, why did she want to write that memoir, Lazy Bee?
Good question.
What's going on?
I think she was ambivalent, like most of us are about our lives. She was ambivalent. She wanted to be famous. She wanted to be remembered.
And she wanted to be thought of in a certain almost
She wanted to have a
legendary
legacy.
way.
I mean,
Yeah.
she was.
And mention when that was that came out. She was still on the
that
court.
was Lazy Bee came out in 2001.
Right.
2001. And so she wanted to be remembered, and she wanted to be a symbol to women. And it was interesting. One of our clerks said, you know, in the Supreme Court, if some of you have been there, but there's this massive hallway leading up to the courtroom, and you can get from one side to the other. You can easily go around it. She, with her clerks, would walk through the middle to walk through the tourists in a kind of regal way to be seen. She wanted to be seen. She knew that she was a symbol. She was the first, and so she cared about that. And she wanted to be seen positive. Don't we all want to be seen positively? But she was a very discreet person. There were a lot of secrets on the court. She had awkward relations with some of her colleagues. I don't think she really wanted to write about that.
Okay, so what I'm getting to is, for instance, David, how long are Justice Ginsburg's papers going to be closed for? I think it was announced recently or reported recently for a very long time, I think, which often is true of justices, am I correct? That's much more the rule. So first question I have is, and I've been waiting to ask you this, is for someone who is private and who wants to be thought of in a certain way, what led her from that to, he's got unbelievable access. Evan did interviews with her and all of her family. Her husband's diaries, her papers, without restriction, as far as I remember.
More or less.
But compared to most justices who are still alive.
You know, frankly, it surprised the hell out of me.
Yeah.
And I think it's because she is so discreet. Now, this gets a little complicated, and I have to be a little bit careful here. Justice O'Connor has, as I think all of you probably know, she has dementia. The diagnosis is dementia, probably Alzheimer's. And when she started, she was lucid enough when she started with me, but the symptoms were starting to show.
So when you
up.
decided to do the book, what year was that?
2016.
Okay.
So 3 years
And did you
ago.
see any signs of this at that point?
You could see because she would repeat herself. When the night I got there, I
Although
watched
I must
her.
say, from my life experience and probably yours,
Yeah, right.
if repeating yourself
what's unusual about
means
that?
Right, I was going to say.
Michael and I
If
were,
I had to throw out everyone I've ever interviewed who repeated themselves.
Michael and I were talking earlier today about one of the problems with book tours. If you do multiple events, you'll repeat the same story in the same performance. So if I repeat a story to you, just wave your hand and say, stop, you already told us the story.
Yes, what I said to Evan is the best thing is you get something like sort of a sushi menu and you check off the story when you've told it to make sure that you don't tell it twice during the same.
Repetition is a good thing up to a point.
Right.
When I arrived there in Phoenix, I watched her work a room of 150 people, and you never would have known anything was
This
wrong
is
with her.
2016.
Yeah, this is 3 years ago. But I'd been told that she had this issue, and you could tell because she would, in kind of uncomfortable ways, repeat herself. But she had made, gradually worked up to this decision to have a biographer do it, and I think she understood the basic.
And was she encouraged by family members?
Yes. Because they understood a basic truth, which is if you're going to do this, do it. Do it. They were smart enough and sophisticated enough. Her 3 sons and she ultimately was, you can't do a half-assed biography here. It's either the whole story, because if you want it to be the only biography, there have been actually, Joan Biskupic wrote a very serviceable, pretty good biography of her without access.
She was still on the court.
She was still in the court without access, and it's a good biography. But if you really want to do the biography that nobody else can repeat, you got to open up the kimono.
But would you tell everyone how unusual?
Sorry.
Maybe Evan, maybe a little different metaphor.
Sorry, it's my wife here. She's going to scold me afterwards.
But would you tell how unusual it is for a historical figure in real time to do that?
It is not unprecedented.
No, but still very unusual.
And there's a big fight about this because the reason why there's a big fight, and I didn't have total access on it, which is the point of this. the papers of a Supreme Court justice are, of course, not just the justices' papers, but the papers of all the other justices, because they're communicating with the other justices. So when you look at the court files and you pull out, Smith v. Jones, you're going to see her work product, her handwritten notes of the conference and her memos from her clerks, but you're also going to see memos from the other justices, if it's a close case, if they're trying to persuade each other, if they're putting together an opinion.
Including people on the court now?
Yes, including, and so here's where the dividing line was. I had access until there was a sitting justice. So I had access up to this Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas was serving with her. So I had access for 10 years, from 1981 to 1991, of her private of her court documents. I had access to all her letters, her diaries, her husband's diaries, all that other stuff. But on the court, I had 10 years. Once there's a justice who's still there, she didn't want me seeing the work product of that justice. So I couldn't see. Now, other justices have done different things. Justice Blackmun famously opened up all his papers. They are pretty revealing. Linda Greenhouse did a book called Becoming Justice Blackmun.
How popular did that make him with other justices?
Extremely unpopular. There was a big fight about it on the court. They were trying to reach they couldn't decide amongst themselves on a informally, I guess you would say the rule is the one I followed, which papers have to be closed up to the point, or can be open only up to the point there's a sitting justice. So I would say that's sort of the rule, but it's not really, because they all disagree with each other. Marshall opened his papers instantly. The whole court was furious at James Billington because they didn't think that was Marshall's real intention to open up his papers, but that was on. He signed a piece of paper saying "Open my papers," so the Library of Congress did.
Yeah.
So it's all over the place. The other big thing here is the clerks, because the clerks, every justice has 4 law clerks, and they're brilliant, almost by definition.
And how many did you and O.C.? By the way, O.C. Thomas is here. Do you mind standing up, O.C.?
Yeah, O.C. she's an important part.
She is a huge part of this book and collaborator.
If you read the acknowledgement, some acknowledgements are untrue. This one's true. She was an absolutely integral part of this book. We did it all together. She went to all the interviews. She did all the research. She's a lawyer. I graduated from law school, but I'm not a real lawyer. She's a real lawyer. She graduated from Stanford like Justice O'Connor. She's a woman of the West. She understood O'Connor better than I did in many ways, so she was deeply involved.
Really impressive. And how many clerks did you all interview?
94.
Can you believe this? 94 clerks.
Now,
track them all down.
Yeah, it wasn't that hard to find them. Now, it's a continuum. Some of them practically embrace you and hand you their diary. Others are a little standoffish. But in every year, there'd usually be one who is pretty forthcoming, and then you can double back to the others. A few of them refused to talk to us for personal reasons or whatever reason. And some were very wary about talking about specific cases. So it varied. We didn't get inside every big case. We got inside most of the big cases. We also had help from the justices, particularly Justice Ginsburg and Justice Stevens, who were very forthcoming. I said to David before coming in that they're old enough to have nothing left to lose. And then, other justices were varied. Justice Breyer was sort of forthcoming, but also careful. He's still on the court, and so it varies.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to the early life. What were the biggest surprises that came to you when you were researching her early life?
We have one little scooplet, which some of you may know. This is a fun one. O.C. and I, this book is very much of a love story between John O'Connor and Sandra O'Connor. And when we were in the Library of Congress, we had access to her correspondence, and there was a lot of it, but no love letters. And O.C. and I are going, where are the love letters between John and Sandra? And we were sure there must be some. So we were over in her chambers, and it turns out not all of her papers, surprise, surprise, not all of her papers made it over to the Library of Congress. Mm-hmm. There, her secretary, Linda Neary, took us down to a storage locker in the basement. Lo and behold, there's a box that's marked correspondence, and we say, what's that? And sure enough, lots of love letters between John and Sandra, but also 14 love letters from Bill Rehnquist to Sandra Day in 1952. Now, later Chief Justice of the United States.
Make sure that this was 1952, not later on.
Right. That's an important distinction the family cares about.
I want everyone to be interested in the book, but maybe not.
not that interesting. Also, sweetly and innocently, back in 1952, a lot less sex. So they had a romantic relationship, and Justice Rehnquist proposed marriage to Sandra Day. Amazingly, they never told their own families about it. We found these letters. They had never told their own children. We called Justice Rehnquist's daughter, and she didn't know about it. And O'Connor, I don't think if O'Connor's sons had known what was in that box, they wouldn't have let us see the box. They just hadn't looked in it. But it's actually a sweet story because Bill Rehnquist falls in love with Sandy, as he called her, as a first-year student, and they go out there and item. But he goes down to the ranch, to the Lazy Bee, and Mr. Day hands Bill a roasted bull's testicle to eat. Let us say the weekend did not go well, and she dumped him. But then she got proposed to by another guy. She was proposed to 4 times at Stanford and engaged a couple of times. Again, it's 1952. Historical context is important. In 1952, if you're a young woman in college, you want to get, the expression was ring by spring, because you're regarded as an old maid. A lot of them couldn't, as I will get to in a minute, couldn't get jobs. And so getting married, and also the men are veterans, 60% of them were veterans, World War II veterans. They want to get on with their lives and get married. So it's a big dating game. And so Justice, or future Justice Rehnquist, he goes off as a third-year student. He's the top of the class, first in his class, and he gets a clerkship with Justice Jackson back in Washington. He goes to Washington and decides that he's lonely, and he remembers Sandy, and he starts writing her these pleading love letters, one of which ends, "Will you marry me?" She strings him along for a couple of months because she's really in love with John, but John's not asking her to marry him. And she wants to keep her options open. Now, it ends nicely. In the end, she marries John, the right match. And Bill Rehnquist marries Nan, love of his life, happily married. And even there's a very sweet letter between them when they go off to Yosemite and sort of talk about it. And, I think, not to be too crass about this, but the fact that they hadn't slept together was useful because they could be friends. And they were lifelong friends because, of course, when she comes to the Supreme Court, they're good friends. Interestingly, not at first, though.
Was there a you deal with it in the book. Tell about the complication that they both felt a little bit.
Well, I have to wonder about this a little bit. Rehnquist was sensitive because Justice Blackmun, the other justices knew that they'd gone out to, quote, to a couple of movies. So Justice Blackmun, on the day that Sandra Day O'Connor comes on the bench, if you've been to the Supreme Court, there's this big high bench there, and the justices sit with each other. And Justice Blackmun sat next to Justice Rehnquist, and Blackmun leaned over to Rehnquist and said, "Now, no fooling around." So Rehnquist was a little sensitive to this, and Justice O'Connor, in her diary, is and we're talking to her friends, is hurt, because Sandra Day O'Connor is coming on the court. She was a state court of appeals judge, an intermediate state court. She was not prepared for the U.S. Supreme Court. Today, not a chance in hell that she would get nominated because she had no judicial track record.
Too much of a leap. Yeah.
And she was too inexperienced, no track record, so it wouldn't have even happened. But in 1981, when Ronald Reagan is looking for the first woman, there aren't any Republican women judges. There are 600 federal judges, 8 of them are women. They're all Democrats, except for one, Cornelia Kennedy. So she sort of gets there by default, but she's brand new, and she wants somebody to help her. And where's Bill? And Bill is nowhere to be seen. Now, it's a little complicated. He had a terrible back problem at the time, and he was on drugs, and they had to detox him in the winter. So he was a hurting guy, and that may have been one of the reasons why he didn't help her. But she was upset about it and hurt that he didn't help her.
Interesting.
They later became very close and had a real bond. A little tricky at the very end, maybe. We can talk about that later. But they were mostly pretty close.
Tell us what John O'Connor was like.
Well, of course, he couldn't ever live up to Sandra's father, but he didn't try. And whereas
So he knew that early on.
he was a very smart, had great emotional intelligence, and he's a very interesting guy to me because on the one hand he's a man's man. He was the big man in Phoenix. He's the head of the law firm, the big law firm. He's head of the Rotary. He's the head of 2 hospitals. He's the head of the Maricopa County Young Republicans. I mean, he's the big man, and he's a very much
Which was a different group in those days from what it would be now.
Well, absolutely. But very, dominated by white males of a certain type who were fraternity brothers at Stanford. He went to Bohemian Grove.
Sort of country club Republican.
Country club
moderate.
Republican, exactly. Country club Republican, and loved country clubs. It was happiest in a blazer with a, So he's a very much of a traditional establishment male. But he was wonderful with Sandra, always, and was proud of her. And didn't defer to her necessarily, although of course did when they moved to Washington, but understood right away how special she was, supported her, helped her be in the state legislature, helped write her speeches, was the bartender when she threw parties at the pool. He knew what all the legislators drank. He was more of a hail fellow. She could be a little chilly. He was more of the hail fellow type. It was a great team. They were literally a team. They would go to parties and do this little shtick about how to be active in your community and to be a community leader. It was kind of a serious subject, but they lightened it up, passing a football back and forth and making jokes. They were just a great couple. Now, it was hard for him when they got to Washington.
Yeah, one of the things you do really well is show how his role changed in her life and in the community, and B, how she felt guilty about that. Talk a little bit.
Well, she did. I mean, she knew when she got the call from Reagan, got the call that she'd been chosen. She says, "Oh God, this is going to change everything," and he says, "Well, of course we're going to do it. Of course we are." And she knew that his life was going to be different because the practice of law in Washington, D.C. is just not the same as Phoenix, and he could not be that kind of big man, local lawyer. For one thing, any law firm that takes him is going to have conflict problems because if they have a case coming up to the Supreme Court, she'd have to recuse. So he had actually trouble getting a job. And it didn't really work out that well. He was not a success. The expression was he's not a good fit. And he left the law firm that he was at and went to another one. And that really didn't work out so well. So this was a tough on his ego. And this interested me because Justice O'Connor, as I think most of you know, was very social. And she was probably the most social justice in history. Now, I know that's not saying much. But she went out an awful lot, often did 2 or 3 things. Why? Well, she liked to dance, and she liked to go out, but she did it, she told me this, for him, so that he could be the social lion, so that at dinner he loved to tell stories, and he loved to dance, and it was good for his ego. She had to read 1,000 pages a day, and in the early years really had a lot of catching up to do, but she made damn sure they went out so that he could shine.
Interesting. And you were talking a little bit about how Ronald Reagan came to choose her, which I learned an awful lot that I did not know about. Would you tell a little bit about the process?
Sure. Reagan made a political promise in October 1980. He was 10 points down, I think it was,
exactly,
with women in the state of Illinois, which was the swing state of the day. And a political advisor said, "Oh, God, we got to do something. You got to promise to put a woman on the Supreme Court." Totally a political gesture from a political advisor to the president. And so he wins. And at the Justice Department, the Young Turks around the Attorney General, led by the chief assistant, was Ken Starr. This is Ken Starr in an earlier life, was the chief assistant to William French Smith, who was the Attorney General. And all the people around the Attorney General think they're going to pick Bork. They don't take this promise seriously.
Right. And William, say a word on Smith, who he was, and politically.
William French Smith was a
Did you say society lawyer?
He was basically a society lawyer, but he said to his troops, no. The president, they thought they were going to pick Bork. French said, no, the president's serious. We're going to pick a woman. If we can find a capable woman, we're going to pick one. And so it was a very short list. Rehnquist was secretly lobbying for her, interestingly. Never revealed that.
So what's going on there? I mean, he obviously thought well of her, but Says a lot for him that he would
Yeah.
lobby for someone where there's going to be at least a little
Yeah,
awkwardness.
it does. I mean, I know that Starr told us that he was the chief force pushing. Also, the Chief Justice who had gotten to know Sandra O'Connor on a boat trip was pushing for her. But according to the people around Smith, the important guy was Rehnquist because he could vouch for how smart she was, which was real. They could not afford to be embarrassed here. You can't put the first woman on and have it go wrong. Sandra O'Connor liked to say, it's good to be first, but you don't want to be the last.
Right, yeah.
And so they were a little nervous about this. And so it helped for Rehnquist to say, no, she is really smart. And a quick study, which in fact, she was. So the story I love about this is when Sandra Day O'Connor was at Stanford, she was high in her class, Order of the Coif. They didn't keep class rank, but very high. And anybody with a B average could apply to any one of 40 law firms. So she applied to all 40 law firms in San Francisco and Los Angeles. She got one interview at Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, and the question was, how well do you type? They were interviewing her to be a legal secretary. Her answer was so-so, and she didn't get the job. Okay, flash forward 30 years
Gibson
later.
Dunn was where William French Smith came
Here's
from,
where
right?
here's where I'm going.
I'm sorry, okay, I don't want to step on your line.
Here's the punchline of the story. 30 years later, William French Smith, who had been a partner at Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, calls up Sandra Day O'Connor to ask her to interview with the President of the United States about being a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. She gets on the phone and says, "You wouldn't be calling me about secretarial work, would you?"
It's not perfect.
So she loved to tell that story, of course, especially at the Gibson Dunn 90th anniversary party.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And when she got on the court, who was she close to, who was she not?
It was a chilly place. I mean, physically chilly because you've been up there. It's marble, it's cold. And she would stand out. I love this detail. In the fall, when it was cloudy and cool, she would stand out and she would look for the sun. She'd go out into those little interior courtyards and turn her face up, looking for the sun.
Because physically, it was different from Phoenix.
It was Phoenix, and the men were not that happy to see her. She went to her first lunch, and only 4 other justices showed up. And she was, what is this about? Well, she learned that just because you're appointed to the Supreme Court doesn't mean you have to like each other. And a book called The Brethren, which some of you may have remembered by Bob Woodward and Scott Armstrong, had just come out.
1980.
And it was an expose, kind of the very first ever expose of the Supreme Court. And the other justices were wary of each other because they didn't know who the leakers were. So they were not going to lunch.
And a lot of the clerks were leakers, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
But they were mad at the clerks, but they were suspicious of each other. And in fact, some of the justices did leak, particularly Potter Stewart, who she replaced. So it's kind of a cold place for her, and she is not getting the love, especially from Harry Blackmun. Harry Blackmun, who famously wrote Roe v. Wade, most important women's rights decision ever, is the only when they voted whether to take Mr. off of it used to be Mr. Justice. Right before she gets there, they take off the Mr., so it's just Justice. The vote was 8-1. The one was Harry Blackmun, and he was a very kind of crotchety guy. And he, in fact, one of the reporters when she was sworn in her investiture, one of the reporters came up to Blackmun and said, "You ready for the big day?" And he said, "Is it?" He was very chilly to her, and a little.
And when he said that, did he know what it sounded like?
Yeah, I think so. He feared that she would be the 5th vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. She's a Reagan appointee, and he thought that
she had been screened.
He thought that she'd been screened. Now the screening was not actually. I know this from her diary. In the meeting with Reagan, he says to her, "Well, I think that life begins at conception, and I think we ought to give that. We ought to assume that." But then he never asked her opinion. Why? He didn't really want to know. They'd gotten this far with her. He didn't want to find out that she was.
Did he also figure there were not great alternatives?
Yes.
Yeah.
They were too far down the road.
Yep.
They couldn't turn back at this point. And also, importantly, we think of Reagan as being the great conservative. Okay, but he didn't want to do the social issues. He wanted to do tax cuts and defense. He did not want to get into a big fight over abortion or school prayer, all the things that Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. You remember the new right was very big on the social issues. Reagan gave lip service to that, but that was not his high priority. So he was perfectly happy just to let her slip in, and she was confirmed 99-0. There was started to be a little insurrection. She helped put it down.
In case you're wondering how things have changed, 99-0.
Right. Yeah. So, she slipped. She was lucky because she had actually voted in the Arizona legislature to decriminalize abortion, and there was she hadn't been totally forthcoming about that, and it could have been a fight. Today, it would have been wall-to-wall, Fox News, CNN, up in smoke. Back in the kinder, gentler 1981, 99-0.
Yeah, life was different.
Yeah.
So if you were talking to someone who does not know anything about what Justice O'Connor did on the court, what are the few things that you think are important for history? How did she change history?
She did in several ways. One, she's the first, so if she did nothing, that would have changed history. But she was very consequential. She was a moderate pragmatist in the middle. She was the swing vote. She didn't like that word because it implied caprice. But she was a swing vote 330 times.
Caprice in a way that was gender related, or just caprice?
Or just on principle. She didn't She didn't like the idea you just blowing in the wind or you're opportunistic. Now she was opportunistic, but she didn't want to be seen that way. So she would publicly say, "I don't want to be called a swing vote," and she would get mad when Charlie Rose or somebody would say, "You're the swing vote." She said, "Well, no, I'm not," and he would say, "Oh, come on," and she would get kind of huffy about it. But she was, let's say, the decisive vote. 330 times in 25 years. That's a lot of power. And where it really mattered was in abortion rights and affirmative action. Those are the two big social issues up there that they fight about.
So let's stop for a second. What if Bork had been appointed instead of her on those two issues?
Different outcomes. Both abortion rights. Roe v. Wade would have been overturned, almost certainly.
So almost 40 years ago.
Right. Long ago it would have been overturned. And same thing with affirmative action, for sure, because he was really against racial preferences. She, interestingly, she found abortion. She said in her confirmation hearings that abortion was personally repugnant to her, but that didn't mean that she was going to, that's what she said. What she's thinking is, I'm not going to tell other women what to do. Now, she changed the standard. She did. She narrowed abortion rights somewhat. She said that states could have some control over abortion, could restrict abortion, but they could not place what they call an unreasonable burden, an undue burden on women. That's kind of a squishy standard. People are mad at her for such a squishy standard, but that effectively preserved abortion rights. In 1992, it looked like there were 5 votes to get rid of it, and she winkled Justice Kennedy away from Justice Scalia to preserve abortion rights. And that's still the law of the land. That may not be the law of the land forever, especially if Ginsburg goes and Trump appoints Amy Coney Barrett, I think her name is. So abortion hangs by a thread, but she preserved it for a long, long time. Same thing with affirmative action. She was not a big fan of affirmative action. She did not like identity politics. She was uncomfortable with racial preference, but she was a highly pragmatic person. And the way her thinking went in the big case that mattered, in the Grutter case, where she wrote the opinion, 5th vote, to preserve affirmative action in higher education, 2002, she looked at a real-life experiment in affirmative action where the state of California passed a referendum to do away with affirmative action, to do away with racial preference. The number of African Americans at UCLA and Berkeley went down to about 1%. Her view was that law schools are training grounds for leaders. I believe 1 out of 4 U.S. senators is a lawyer. And she thought it's just not tolerable for society to have law schools have so few African Americans. It's just not right. And she was very influenced at the same time by briefs from businessmen arguing a similar argument, but also by the military, by former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Colin Powell, submitted a brief, which said, in the military, we figured the officer corps has got to look like America. And we have affirmative action. We do have racial preference. And it's worked pretty well. And she was very influenced by the practical impact. So doctrinally, all the conservatives are upset because if you're Justice Roberts, the Constitution is colorblind, and they don't like racial preference. And they are close to, actually, I think, doing away with affirmative action. If one more justice maybe they may be there already, actually, with Kavanaugh replacing Kennedy. This Harvard case, by the time it gets to the Supreme Court in 2 years, that could be the end of affirmative action in higher education. But she preserved it all those years. So those are very consequential things. She was also really smart on religious Establishment Clause thing. I won't get too much of the weeds in here, but she had a very big impact on the degree to which states can establish religion, the extent to which they can promote religion. She really did the most intelligent thinking and really wrote the standard that still applies on that.
Mm-hmm. Evan and I are going to talk for about 5 more minutes, and then I hope you'll have questions. There are microphones on either side. Bush v. Gore. Tell us that story.
Now, Bush v. Gore is the case that she least liked to talk about. No wonder, because as you will remember, to set the scene, 2000, basically it's a tie, but in the state of Florida, Bush appears to have won by 500 votes, and the Republican Secretary of State certifies his electors. But, of course, you remember the hanging chads and all that. There's a recount. And the Gore folks want to keep that recount going because they think if you keep going, Gore will win. It's a law case. It comes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court stops the recount.
How wide was the recount?
Oh, it was within 300 votes. I mean,
Yeah.
it was. Now, I'm going to get to what it would have been in the end, but,
Yeah.
but this is a bit of an elaborate story. But I want to go into some detail here because
it's
there's
fascinating.
such hot feelings about this.
Yeah.
So the Supreme Court stops the recount, 5-4. Now, the 5 to stop are all conservative Republicans, and the 4 who want the recount to continue they're not all Democrats, but they're all liberals. Looks as partisan as all get out. It looks like it was just a straight party line vote. And people in this audience are still mad about it because it looked like just a naked power play. Now, Justice O'Connor was a Republican. Yes, she was. And, a partisan. But I'm pretty well convinced that what she was looking at, and we first learned about this from Justice Ginsburg. Justice O'Connor, with her practical bent, was looking down the road at what happens if the recount continues. There was a chance that Gore would get ahead, and that you would have 2 sets of electors, the Republican, the ones already certified for Bush, and a new set certified for Gore.
And hadn't this happened in 1876 also,
Right.
and she didn't
So
want to
there's
see it?
actually, believe it or not, precedent for this, and there's a law.
Yeah.
3 U.S. Code 15. What happens is it goes to Congress, and the House has a vote, and the Senate has a vote. Now, the House was going to be Republican. The Senate was going to be Democratic. Tie. What happens in the case of a tie? The law says the governor of the state will decide. The governor of the state, his last name was Bush, Jeb Bush. It's going to be a banana republic car wreck, It was going to look like the guy's brother elected him. And so she was looking down the road and saying, Bush is going to win anyways, and it's going to be ugly, so we're going to stop it now. So now that was her reasoning. She knew it still looked bad. The decision that they wrote, the per curiam decision, which she had a lot to do with, the reasoning was terrible. Whole law reviews have been devoted to dismembering it. It's not a precedent for anything.
Equal protection.
The equal protection argument by a bunch of Republicans, it was twisted and just indefensible. Basically, if you're on a law review, you look at that, you hold your nose. I'm going to use a crude profanity here, but it comes from a Supreme Court justice. Justice Scalia said the equal protection argument was, as we say in Brooklyn, a piece of shit. And it kind of was. And she felt uncomfortable about this. She would be asked about it. She'd say, oh, get over it, But, interestingly, in 2012, so 12 years later, she did tell the Chicago Tribune editorial board, well, maybe we should have not taken the case. Maybe we should have let it go.
Now, I know, what was going on there? Why did she say that?
She had regrets. I asked her about it. She said, well, yes, I did have some regrets, but regrets don't do you any good. So she was still bothered by it. I think that Justice Stevens has a pretty good argument that we should have let the process play out. Just let the law play out and see what happens. Because by intervening this way, it looked so partisan that it made the court look bad.
Who do you think would have been president had that happened?
Bush. Because, as my wife Osi likes to point out, And actually, as Justice O'Connor liked to point out, the media, there was a giant recount done where they actually did the recount. It got lost in the shuffle, but there were three of them.
And Bush won, right?
And Bush won,
Yeah.
all of them. The only one in which Gore won was both the undervotes and the overvotes. It would have taken a year. Was not going to happen. So actually, and Justice O'Connor used to like to point this out, Bush was going to win anyways.
Fascinating. Last thing I'd like to ask before we go to you, tell the story of why she came to resign from the court, which is just, Evan writes about this so poignantly.
Her beloved husband, John, got Alzheimer's, and the symptoms start showing up in the late 90s, and she was determined to care for him.
How early on was he diagnosed?
Diagnosed in 2000, actually, right before Bush v. Gore. That was a bit of a factor because, I won't get into it.
Well, in fact, tell about election night, because people know.
Election night, this has got in the press. On election night, she's at a party, and it's about 7:30 at night. The networks called Florida for Gore.
Right.
And she said, "Oh, this is terrible," and walked out. And then her husband, John, said, "Oh, we were planning on retiring. This is terrible. We were planning on retiring. We needed a Republican to win." So this got in the newspapers, and it really looked like that she had voted.
Because there were a lot of people standing around.
Yeah, there were a lot of people, and so this got. In fact, in the Small World department, I wrote the story in Newsweek about this. It's ironic because although this legend became, oh, she voted for Gore so that she could retire, it's actually the opposite. Yeah. Once she had voted for Bush,
yeah.
Once she had voted for Bush, in effect, she told her family, we can't retire now because it will look like we voted this way, so we could. So
especially since you had written that story in Newsweek.
Yeah. But she said we're not hanging out. We're not hanging out with the White House. No lunches. No Bush family. They were Bush family friends. We're not doing any of that. So she waits 5 years.
Because they had been fairly close to the parents.
She
right?
played tennis with Barbara every Tuesday. So they were close, and they were birds of a feather, country club Republicans and all that. But so she waited 5 years. But finally, John's Alzheimer's got so bad that she had to retire. And she said, I'm leaving the court. He sacrificed for me. Now, when we came to Washington, now I'm going to sacrifice for him. She was at the height of her power.
Remind us of what year this was?
2005. And it was the O'Connor court at that time. And so she left to take care of him, but within 6 months, he barely recognized her, and she had to put him in a home anyways. And he formed what is called a mistaken attachment. This is common in Alzheimer's. He fell for another woman, and whose name was Kay.
Who was there with him?
Who was with John in the home. Yeah. And she would come to the home, and John would be holding hands with Kay. And once John introduced Kay to Sandra as his wife. You can imagine how incredibly painful that was. Now, publicly, she said, I'm happy for him because he's not depressed. Privately, her heart was broken. But you know what she did? She would come in, and he'd be holding hands with Kay, and she would sit down and hold his other hand. It was heartbreaking, but it's just classic of her. Just, you do the best you can.
And did she have regrets over having left the court?
Yeah, she said so. It was, quote, the dumbest mistake I ever made.
Because if she had waited 6 months?
Well, she didn't, right. She was replaced by Alito, and she didn't like Alito because Alito's a hard right guy and was going to get rid of affirmative action and vote against abortion and affirmative action. And she said she was uncharacteristically indiscreet about this with her friends. She was very discreet generally, but she said, I don't like Alito, and he's going to undo my legacy, and she was very cranky about the whole thing. And she got along with everybody, but not with Alito.
Was she happy with her life after she left the court?
She was sad. She was sad. She got over it because life has to go on, and she created a cause, a good cause. She was a very big believer in civic government and in civility. Interestingly, when she was on the court, she summoned the majority leader of the Senate and the minority leader, Trent Lott and Tom Daschle, got him in her chambers and said, you guys got to get along, you got to be more civil to each other. Very unusual for a Supreme Court justice to do something like that. But she really cared about civility. It's a blessing that she has Alzheimer's now because she would hate what's going on right now. and she could already see it was headed in that direction. But she cared very much about civic government, and she was bothered that kids today don't know anything about civics. So she started something called iCivics, a nonprofit, which is video games for middle schoolers to learn about civics. Reaches 6 million kids a year now, and she said, interestingly, that was her greatest legacy, not being on the court, but starting iCivics, because it affected so many kids. So her life was worthwhile, but she was sad.
So you get an idea of what an astounding book this is. Can we give a hand to Evan? And those with questions, if we could go to one microphone or the other. And I think we are always requested to ask if it's possible that the question will have a question mark at the end of the question rather than a period or an exclamation point.
Don't be shy.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. Some years ago, I can't remember now, but I took my niece, who was a college intern, to a talk that Justice O'Connor gave at Smithsonian. And she told a story of when she was the only woman on the court, there was no robing room or anything for her, so she would go to the ladies' room and then meet some of the female attorneys who would be arguing in front of her. And she made kind of a joke of it, but she said she was happy when Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg came on the court, because then they got a robing room. Can you talk more about like how, to me that was a kind of a terrible injustice, but it was a great effect that Bader Ginsburg had actually for the physical environment of the court. And I didn't know if you wanted to comment on it.
She said she was glad when Justice Ginsburg got on the court for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons was they finally put in a ladies' room near the conference room. She and Justice Ginsburg, she welcomed Justice Ginsburg, who came in 12 years after she did, but they were on the same side of many issues, but they were not actually personally close. They worked together, but Justice Ginsburg surprised us by saying that not in all of her years on the court with Justice O'Connor never once came to her chambers to talk about a case. Justice Ginsburg did go to Justice O'Connor's chambers under the following circumstances. Justice Ginsburg was a bad driver, and our Justice O'Connor's messenger told us that she rear-ended Justice O'Connor's car in the garage. And so OC and I went to see Justice Ginsburg, and this is the last question we asked. Is it really true that you rear-ended the...
Is this because you were worried about getting kicked out?
Yeah, we thought there was a question that would not be well received, and so we said, is it really true that you hit her car? And Justice Ginsburg said, oh, yes. She said, I've never driven again. She explained to us that she was trying to avoid hitting Justice Scalia's car.
A psychiatrist could do a lot with that, I guess. And how about the other women who later came onto the court? What kind of relationships?
Good. I mean, Justice Kagan models herself a bit as a sort of moderate and somebody who can fix things and get to five, as they say. Justice Sotomayor recounted a couple of things that were interesting. One was that on the very first morning that she was there, Justice O'Connor standing in her chambers, and she says to Justice Sotomayor, whatever you do, be decisive, because they won't take you seriously around here unless you're decisive. And she also said, Justice Sotomayor told us that she heard from the other justices that Justice O'Connor was fixed on people coming to lunch. Now, this may sound like a small thing, but it's not. When she first came to the court, only half the court was coming to lunch, and Justice O'Connor made it her business to get people to come to lunch, and she would sit in their chambers until they came to lunch. And Justice Thomas told us a story that was, Justice Thomas was difficult on this subject because he came to the court, and this is him telling the story. He came to the court after the Anita Hill hearings, and he said that he was feeling, as he put it, hammered and lonely. And on the first day after the first
Even on the court.
on the court.
Uh-huh.
So he's walking down after his first conference alone, and she walks with him and says to him, "Those hearings were very damaging." And he doesn't know what to say. Damaging to him personally, yes. Damaging to the court, yes. And so he doesn't say anything, and she doesn't say anything. But the next day, she walks with him again, and the next day, and the next day. And she says, "Clarence, you got to come to lunch." And finally she says, and he doesn't want to come to lunch. He wants to go sulk in his office. And finally she says, "Clarence, you got to come to lunch." And he said, "Yes, ma'am." And he did. And he did. And he said it changed everything for him. Mm-hmm. Because he's actually a very garrulous, just as Thomas is. I got a deep laugh, and he's a warm guy. He was sulking, but he stopped, and he started coming to lunch. And he said to me, "You know, she was the glue on this court. She's the reason why this place was civil." It's gotten less civil since she left. It's not, some of that warmth that she brought to the court has worn off.
And look at the way you described the way it was when she came on in the early 80s.
Yeah, it was a chilly place, and it's pretty chilly right now, I gather. But she made it her business. I mean, you can be all gender stereotyped about this lunch and all that, but she really believed in food as a way to bring people together. I mean, Hattie Babbitt, Governor Babbitt's wife, told us that Bruce Babbitt, after Bush v. Gore, they ran into in a movie theater, and they were mad as hell about Bush v. Gore. You know, how the hell could you do that? And even though they had been friends from Arizona. And Sandra said, "Let's go have dinner together." And she brought him home, and she made him a pea salad. And they did not talk about Bush v. Gore, but they talked about everything else. And by the end of the evening, they were getting along again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was classic her. Sir.
Evan, this is a sort of a personal question. If you look at all the books you've written, they tell stories about people who came out of nowhere and did major things. Dwight Eisenhower, Obama, Sandra Day O'Connor. Is that your preference in writing? Or I think if you were going to teach a class of women who were going to be lawyers, would you use Sandra Day O'Connor as a model for them? Would you use Eisenhower as a model for soldiers and what they can do? Is it just, uniqueness of the people, or you have something in your heart that wants to teach people things?
Well, I've also written books about entitled preppies, so I wrote The Wise Man with Walter Isaacson. So and about some very rich entitled guys who ran the CIA. But to your point,
Yeah.
look,
But
one of the
very, very critically and disparagingly.
one of the great things about this country, I hate to be cliched about this, is we have a history of people coming from nowhere to do great things. And often what they bring with them is a kind of humility. Dwight Eisenhower was not the world's greatest combat fighter. In fact, he was never in combat. He was not really a great strategic general. But he was awfully good at getting along with other people, partly because he was willing to be underestimated. And he had a basic humility about him. Now, obviously, he had an enormous ego. You don't conquer Europe without having a giant ego. And as Michael can attest, he had a big temper, too, and he could be pretty rough on his subordinates. But part of him...
His son would really attest, as we've discussed.
His son was I had a great time getting to know his son, and said, his son told me, John said, "I think I was born standing at attention." But there was a kind of humility about Ike that was very helpful, partly because he came from Kansas, dirt poor, from some religious fundamentalists out in the middle of nowhere, and he didn't go to Groton. I mean, he came from, and all of these figures. I also have more complicated cases, Richard Nixon, who both benefited from his Nowheresville background and also was horribly insecure about it. And it led him to do great things, and also in the end brought him down.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Awesome. Hi. First of all, thank you so much. I recently did my senior thesis on gender bias in the Supreme Court. So hearing you talk about the first female justice was really remarkable. My question has to do, I noticed that a lot of the stories you told involved the men in her life, like her brother, her father, her husband, Justice Rehnquist, and then President Reagan later on. And I was kind of wondering why you thought that was. Do you think it's because it's a male-dominated field of politics and judicial issues, or are there other reasons that truly gravitated or that you chose to discuss stories that involved the men in her life?
Well, yes, she, by definition, as a young woman rising in the 50s and 60s, she's dealing with men. That's what you got in the Arizona legislature, and that's what you had in the Arizona government, and that's what you had in the U.S. Supreme Court. She was the first. So she's dealing with men. But you recall also that I talked about her mother and how really important her mother was to her, because her mother was great at dealing with obnoxious men. Her father. It was a useful lesson. And Sandra OConnor was very good at men. Yes, she was. She flirted with them in a kind of a non-sexual way. And she was good at men, but she was also great at women. She had great women friends, and they were important to her.
That he writes quite a lot of.
She had a social
Tell about
group.
a couple of them.
Well, Cynthia Helms was her great
just
pal
died.
who just died, who had been married to Richard Helms, head of the CIA. She had, when her husband went off to Bohemian Grove, this male retreat, she went off with her female friends. They were known as the Mobile Party Unit, because they went to a cowboy bar in Idaho, and some cowboy picked up Sandra OConnor and started dancing with her, having no idea that she was a justice on the Supreme Court.
Perfect. And what professional woman was she closest to in life, would you say?
Well, she liked Barbara Bush. Professional woman
That she worked with.
That she worked with.
I'm trying to get across how rare it was
Yeah,
for.
I'm
she was
struggling
coming into an area of life where.
There just weren't any.
Yeah.
I mean, Ginsburg, obviously, they weren't personally close. They certainly worked.
But Ginsburg was not on the court until 13 years into her.
Yeah, I mean, there just weren't any. You know, she was one of 5 women at Stanford in her class, and only 3 graduated. She was one of 2 people on the law review. I mean, it was just a male, particularly the law. I love this detail. Her husband had the job at his law firm in Phoenix of explaining to female applicants why they couldn't come to work at the law firm. And the answer was because the men couldn't talk to each other if there were women there. This is not that far long ago, folks. It's just the way it was. And she weathered it by not, as I said earlier, she was smart about not picking stupid fights. Every once in a while, she'd have to stand up to the fellows. I love this story. When she was the majority leader of the state Senate, the House Appropriations Committee chairman was a guy named Tom Goodwin, and they had to work a lot on the budget. And Goodwin was a drunk by 10 a.m. drunk. And she finally called him on his drinking, and he said, "If you were a man, I'd punch you in the nose." And she said, "If you were a man, you could." So she could do that. But that's the important part of that story is actually that's the exception. That's a one-off. She saved her shots. She picked her shots. She was much better about just walking away from stupid fights. It's not that she was unaffected by them. Her assistant told me that she found Senator O'Connor crying in the ladies' room. I mean, she was human. When the guys were rough on her, she had an involuntary twitch, a little shake like this. And Alfredo Gutierrez, who was the Democratic leader, would say to his buddies, "Watch this, I'm going to make her twitch." And then he would go after her. And the guys would, have fun. And she just dealt with it.
Tell the John Riggins story for those who don't remember it.
Remember, John Riggins, the great Washington Redskins Super Bowl hero, at a congressional dinner in 1985, I think it was. He had too much to drink and passed out under his table underneath her chair. But not before saying to her, "Loosen up, Sandy baby." And a lot of her friends thought, "Oh, this is so embarrassing to you. It's in the papers." And Kay Graham said, "You're never going to live this down." She didn't care. John's diary, they thought this was amusing. She'd seen a lot of drunken cowboys in her life. This, didn't bother her. And she teased him. She said, I forget what was the line? Do you remember what she said to Riggins? She brought him some flowers at the stage door.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But she said something funny to him about...
Loosen up, John.
Yeah, she said to him, "Loosen up. Yeah.
Right.
You need to loosen
And
up."
what was the occasion? He was in a play here, right? Yeah.
He was in a play, and she bought him roses at the stage door. I mean, that was her. It was,
That was
she
class,
could
yeah.
disarm things by making them a joke.
I've enjoyed this opportunity to get to know her better through your writing. My question to you is, who in American history would you want to have a conversation with, and why?
Wow. Where do we begin? I mean, there's so many great. I would be intimidated by Thomas Jefferson, but I sure as hell like to talk to him. You know.
Or
I mean,
what
all
other
those,
women also?
well, of course. You know, I was blessed to be able to talk to Sandra Day O'Connor. I mean, one of the blessings of our work is that I've interviewed a half a dozen presidents in the Oval Office. You know, I've talked to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I've been to, you know, Afghanistan to interview the ruling general. I mean, you know, it's one of the great joys of my life has been the opportunity to talk to a lot of Americans, powerful Americans, but also Americans who are not powerful. Right. And that is, you know, one of the great things about my job, and I'm more of a journalist than an historian. I do write history, but I spent 33.
I'm going to argue with Evan here, but
I spent 33 years in journalism. And,
but as a very history-minded scholarly journalist.
No, that's true. That is true. But I was a lot of things in journalism, but I was never bored. I was fearful and worried and anxious and all those. I had a lot of disagreeable emotions, but not boredom. Partly because we got to talk to so many interesting people all day long, every day. And that's true. Book writing is different. It's a longer timeline. But for this, OC and I interviewed 350 people for this book. That's a lot of people. And they were mostly smart lawyers, but not entirely. I interviewed her trainer and her messenger and her driver and, you know, I mean, all the people around her. Anybody I could find who knew her.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I think we've got time for one more, sir.
Evan, can you tell us, we didn't hear the story about how the deal got consummated for you to do the book.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe, could you also, when you first started working on this book, you were working with her. And progressively over time, like I noticed you've talked about her in the past tense.
Yeah, I apologize for that. She's alive. I saw her 2 weeks ago. I brought her the book.
Can you talk a bit about how your work went from direct stories with her to the stories with the family and others,
yes,
that transition, and what it's been like for you to sort of lose that connection with her, given that you were so close to her to work on this book?
Truthfully, I wasn't that close to her. She already had, the dementia had begun, and I knew.
Had you known her over the years much?
A little bit.
Tell
and I, this is a funny story. OC and I were we had her husband's diary every night. And OC sat next to John at a dinner at the Australian Embassy, and we were wondering if she was going to show up. Sure enough, there's OC, very attractive woman from Stanford. That was my wife. They talked about the law, because OC's a lawyer. So I had some social contact with her, as you do in Washington, because I work for the Washington Post Company, and but I didn't know her well. I had this one day with her as a possible ghostwriter. So I go out to Phoenix and meet her, and I know that she's already, she's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So I know that I'm not going to quote her extensively.
Where was she living at that point?
She was living in an assisted home facility. I had to make sure she really wanted to do the book, so I sat there with her son and said, you want to do this? Yes, I do, because she wanted a legacy. But I also knew that I wasn't going to get a ton out of her, and what I really needed from her was a letter from her to her law clerks, to her friends, and to the other justices saying, please cooperate, because that opened a lot of doors, and I mean, really, it was essential. I did get to know her some slowly. She was guarded, but one day in particular I spent with her where she did let her guard down and really started talking a lot about the ranch and growing up and her marriage, and there was a wonderful...
And she remembered the distant things better
Yes,
than
I mean, that's typical. Yeah. I mean, she her distant past dear to her. I mean, when I went to see her a couple of weeks ago, she remembered the Lazy Bee. We sat there and looked at pictures of her ranch growing up, and she knows her family. And she's, the polite way of putting it, she's in the moment. But she is, if you can take her to the distant past, she can go there. She has vivid, in her love of the West. And I remember sitting in this strip mall with her, looking at what I thought was an unremarkable view of some hills beyond. To her, it was magic. She was pointing out the cactus and how the light struck it. I mean, she had this deep love for the place where she grew up. They said, she liked to say it was our own country, 160,000 acres. It was 8 miles from the road to her house. I mean, it took a day, a man on horseback to ride across it. So this was a special world that she grew up in.
Amazing. Well, we have books for sale up here. Anything else to mention?
Thank you for coming.
Thank you all very much for coming.